Hello and welcome to this month's process breakdown video. As always, we'll be going through each of the pieces done this month, taking a look at the Photoshop files and the step-by-step on how I made each of the pieces. So it also gives me a chance to talk about some of the challenging parts of the painting and so on and so forth. And without further ado, these are the 5 pieces that we will be talking about in this video. Unfortunately, there's another set on the way that I couldn't quite get it wrapped up for this month, but don't worry, we'll be able to see it soon. So without further ado, let's start with this first piece here in the center. So for this first piece here, the intention was to create something that I usually don't do, which is more of like this sort of studio shot feeling for a piece. Kind of like the lighting and the posing and the stuff looks like it's a bit of like a magazine cover. So I thought it would be interesting to try something like that. And to begin with, I started with a rough sketch, basically just to lay out sort of what the composition might look like. For example, how much space each character takes up and what is their like general positioning and pose, right? And then after that, I tested some of the local values and a bit of lighting. So I figured out that they might be like standing in like a street, so it's kind of like a street photo shoot type of deal. And you know, it's a lot of experimenting, so I sort of figured my way around things, and I realized, hey, okay, so composition wise it might be good to essentially leave the characters faces as like the sort of brightest part of the composition, because with this sort of like very frontal lighting, I find it a bit difficult to manage where the bright spots come up, because for example in other situations where the light comes from like a side angle or some alternative angle, I usually have the freedom to sort of manage where do I want the light to show up and which areas I want it to emphasize, right? So if, for example, if the light instead came from the left, the composition will look quite different. For example, the half of this character's face will be in shade, like a lot of these areas will be in shade, and same goes for this character, right? So it'll look something like this, where the light comes from the side. So, but since we're doing like a frontal light setup, it's sort of difficult to kind of like emphasize where the light should come from and which area it should highlight, right? So to sort of solve that or circumvent that, I decided to simply just have like the light come from the front and then have like the characters' faces, which are the focal points, like take most of the light. Right, so the example here is as if the light came from the side, right? Immediately, right, we clearly have a different look to it, we clearly have a different feel to it, and then it's easier to manage where the highlights end up, so I don't end up highlighting a lot of the image, right? Compared to the intended presentation here, where light just hits frontally and everything gets lit up brightly, right? So in this case, I have to sort of like manage and make sure the characters' faces are still the focal point. And from here on out, once the sort of basic idea is confirmed, things get a bit easier. I just sort of toss in the colors with a bit of manual painting plus soft light, prior to that to lay down the base. And then just continue painting from there on. Paying attention to small things like, okay, so the positioning of the shoulder here is a bit weird. So I notice it and then I start fixing things up, right? At the same time, there's a couple of like very rough adjustments that are beginning the background because I'm figuring out, okay, I need to show like the texture of the like the metal shutters that tend to like be in this kind of like very grungy street photo shoots. Yeah, so again, at this part, I'm just figuring out the precision stuff and then finding out like, okay, so how to introduce a bit more color to say this character's jacket. And at this stage, I found out that, okay, so this character is a bit too much pushed to the corner, so let's give her a bit more space. And then like the adjustment continues from there. And here you can see I took some time to paint their faces a bit more, so they definitely look a bit better from this step to this step. So in this current stage, a lot of the big things are fixed as always, and depending on the situation, this might be like more of a relaxing moment, because as you can see, a lot of the big changes have already happened, and now we're just sort of making sure the small details hold up to scrutiny. And one thing interesting I found out is that a lot of times with this sort of frontal lighting, you have to be a bit more precise, meaning that you can't just have the usual top surface is bright and bottom surface is dark. I know the muscle memory kind of tells us to do that, but with like this sort of frontal lighting, you have to be careful not to accidentally do that as well. And I lay on some color adjustments using selective color to sort of figure out what the final effect might look like. And then of course I turn it off for a bit to continue painting. Because the thing about selective color is that it adds like a nice transition to the color, and it's just annoying to like paint or when you're already in this mode and then you have to like pick the right color for each shade of value. So to keep things simpler, I usually return to this kind of grayscale for like areas where there are no actual colors in the piece, so that I can apply it later on and it'll still give me that consistent effect. And right here's where I realized, okay, so things are a bit messy. There's like a shadow here for no reason. I don't know why it's there. And then so I decided, okay, let's clean things up a bit more, and then just have like the cast shadows from each of the characters, like just clean things up, right? And then make sure things are where they should be, like this cast shadow here and this cast shadow here. So this is going to give us very concrete information on where the light is coming from, and also justify, you know, as to why the light is strong, right, as it is. Because otherwise, you know, like if we have this like sort of very sloppy kind of a cast shadow or shadows on the wall, on the back surface here, it's not going to tell us too much about what kind of light source, or it's not going to be able to justify, right, this very strong and light source that's being reflected by like the faces and like highlights on the jacket. Right, so once this is done, it also gives us a bit more time to like painting more details, like work on small things here and there. So the process is quite organic. There really isn't like a to-do list or like a correct list for myself. Usually it's fairly organized at the beginning to get all the big things down sort of in the right places, and then I go a bit loose and start fixing up areas that I think need the most attention. Right, and then considering again the usual stuff, like for example the side of the character's chest is visible because of how this pose is. So right, instead of having this very flat area here, which almost suggests like a sort of strange cave in from the side of the ribs, right, it's actually a bit of like a bump. So things like that, right, you have to pay attention to and fix. And then as we go on, I decided, okay, let's try out this reference I found that for this jacket that looks really cool. So I think it adds a nice dash of color, and I think it fits quite well in this context as well. So again, a lot of times when you're looking for design, it's important to look up some references and sort of figure out what options do you have, right? Of course, you can manipulate and change a lot of the visual references to your own preference, and then have essentially something of your own. But it's always good to like look for more ideas, or even things to prompt you yourself to think of some ideas. Right, for example, this necklace here is also from like a reference. I'm not a jewelry designer, so of course, you know, if you ask me from the top of the head, I'm just going to create something really generic. So, you know, references are great to help yourself with this kind of things. Right, and as we continue, there's, as you can notice, I adjust the pose a little bit from here to here, right? Like one hand goes into the pants pocket instead of the jacket pocket to keep a bit of asymmetry, right? So I thought this was like a cool decision to make, because prior to this, I just felt like both characters just have all their hands in their pockets, and it's kind of a bit too boring. So I thought this would be a nice addition of asymmetry, right, for this character here. And then a bit more adjustment to the anatomy and the general pose and gesture. And then the final wrap up. So again, the selective layer is really powerful. The selective color layer is really powerful because, as you can see here, we don't just we're not just only able to adjust the colors, but I can adjust the brightness as well. So we find that if we want, say for example, the skin area to be more like overexposed, we can easily select the red, and then just pull back the bottom slider here. So it's going to make things just straight up brighter, right? If we want to add a blue tint, we can also do so with yellow. Right, I want to add a red tint, we can increase the magenta and essentially play with these. So this is kind of like the result that I managed to get to and that I like for this piece here, and so this is why I stuck with. So once we reach this stage, there'll inevitably, right, be something, small things that you want to pay attention to and change. So at this point, I'm not too particular because there's only going to be really small changes. So I just continue painting on top of this sort of like a post-processed piece. So you can see nearing the final parts of the piece, essentially adjusted the character's pose a bit more, right? Because here she's looking a bit too stiff. It's like standing really straight up. So add a bit of like this slight backwards lean, which I thought was interesting. Because right now, as you can see here, right, both characters are sort of like standing straight up. Whereas with this one, you can see she's standing this way and she's standing this way. So it has like a nice, more dynamic effect to it. In fact, this is only, I only made this change like as I was making this video. Because it's been a while since I painted this, and then it was like, oh, okay, I can try this thing out. So I've updated the full-size image with this new version, so we can go and check out and download this version if you prefer. Right, and then yeah, so this is pretty much where we end up for this piece. Moving on to the next piece. For this piece, it is the first in this month's set, and so the idea here was to sort of capture like a character's journey on a boat on a lake. And of course, I have no idea how to draw someone rowing a boat, because again, I haven't observed it in real life a lot, right? And I've really never seen it in media or practiced drawing it. So to begin with, to help ourselves, I actually searched up quite a few references of, you know, what angles is it good to capture like someone that's on a boat, what angles are, you know, interesting enough. And so for this piece, I've managed to use, or rather find and use this reference here. So I think this reference gives like I feel like this particular reference is really good because it shows you, you know, a lot of information very clearly that we can make use of. Right? We do not have to use the lighting, we do not have to use like the material or even the background composition, right? So the idea is that we try to look at how like the gesture of the pose goes, right? Where the weight of the character lies, where they are looking and all that. So sort of with the help of this reference, we're able to create this sketch here, right? Focusing on a lot of the things like, okay, so how is this leg position? And then we notice, okay, so when the characters, or rather when the person sits here, right, their leg sort of like goes across almost, and it's really extended out, and then there's a bit of a bend, and then their foot sort of rests on the bottom of the boat, while the other leg kind of like goes up and it's tucked in like underneath like the knee of the straightened leg. So this is kind of the small things that pay attention to when I'm using reference, right? Because we're trying to capture the gesture and make the gesture look natural. So of course there'll be plenty of opportunity to rectify things later on, but that doesn't mean, right, we should waste the good reference material. We want to extract the correct information and then we want to make use of it well. Right, so moving on from this particular basic sketch, I decided, okay, I have to figure out what kind of lighting scheme that I want to use. So right from the start, I decided, okay, I want something of like a bright light source in like a dim setting. So it's been a while since I did this kind of lighting, so I almost lost a bit of the familiarity with it. So it's a bit tough at the beginning to find exactly what is the right, you know, value range to play around with. So you can see here, I tried a bit more with like adding details and then having like a horizon, sort of horizon line being more marked out so that I can add things like leaves. And so this was like a good position for me because I thought, okay, this would be like a nice way to show that this is not like a giant ocean or a massive like lake as before, but rather something a bit smaller. There you have like this sort of forest in the background where the leaves kind of fall onto like the river or like this body of water and that the character is in. right? And then adding in a bit of color with selective color and soft light, and then making some adjustments to like tune down the extremely strong red tint. Okay, so as you can see, at this point in time, we haven't done too much with painting the character themselves. It's because I'm really trying to figure out how exactly to proceed with the composition as a whole. So that takes a bit of time because sometimes you just have to explore the options. You don't really know what is exactly what you run right off the bat. So for example here, I usually I would paint the how do I put it? Usually I would use something like a brush to like paint a lot of the leaves, and then just use free transform and the transformation tools to like spread them out. But in this case, I thought it might be interesting to use manually paint in like this kind of zigzag, like this kind of very compressed and squished, right? Very squished zigzag pattern to essentially represent sort of like the depth and the camera angle that we're using, because we are looking at it sort of like from close to eye level. So like the surface of the water is going to look kind of compressed almost in terms of like space on the canvas, right? And then I explore other ideas, like for example, okay, what if the boat is like sailing through the lake and it's pushing the leaf petals or cherry blossom petals aside? So it's going to like create this interesting curvy pattern here, right? So interesting pattern here. Again, a lot of this, right? For example, I have no idea that, but you know, when boats sail through leaves on water, it did this pattern. So again, references helped a lot, right? For me to sort of figure out, okay, so hey, that could be interesting to sort of show like the movement of the character or the boat by having like these sort of trails going on or patterns that indicate, you know, movement, right? And then moving on to the next step, again, I adjusted essentially the size of the body of water by essentially drawing like these couple of strokes here. So what this does is essentially like push back the entire backdrop. So here it looks like there are rocks and this tree is maybe like 50 meters away. But in here it's like, okay, so it's like 200 meters away, right? So just by pushing things closer to the horizon line, it sort of changes up the sort of perception you get. So I like this particular positioning because it's not too close and it's not too far. So I'm happy with that, and then I can proceed with adjusting colors a bit more, and then doing a bit of major painting on the character. Right, as you can see here, quite a bit of adjustments being done to the boat. I actually painted the boat more properly, and then yeah, smaller but very important changes that need to be done as well, because you can see like functionally these two are pretty much the same thing, but because the big things are settled, it's important that we also pay attention to like actually painting sort of like the elements themselves in a better way, right? Compositionally things are fine, but of course, we are not just presenting a composition, we're presenting like a whole experience, sort of. So it's important to have things more complete. Right. And moving on to this next step, I actually thought of something quite interesting. Right, because as we saw before, in this particular shot, things look a bit too flat, right? Because everything is sort of like in like the mid ground, and then like for instance the character and the entire boat is in the mid ground, right? They're all in the mid ground, and then like we have like the background over here. So in terms of the foreground, right, there's nothing here at all. So that's not good for us, because in real life, or not rather in real life, right, but in good compositions and good photography compositions even, it's always good to show depth when you can, because otherwise, unless you're going for a very specific effect, it can have an unintentional result of making the image look a bit too flat. So I thought it might be nice to say, okay, what if instead of having like the lantern on like the chair here and just being there and essentially like being like equal in tier, or rather equal in magnitude, right? For example, this is like a magnitude 1, this is like a magnitude 1. They sort of exist on the same scale, which is not really good for us when we're trying to present something with depth, right? Usually it's good to have something really, really close, something in the middle, and something really, really far away. So when we can capture the full range, it usually has a very nice depth effect. So, right, so this kind of justifies how I decided to have the lantern in the foreground, right? So close that it's even out of focus. So I thought this was really nice because it also saved me a bunch of effort in drawing a lot of details here. So I thought that was really nice. But, right, it also still gives us a chance to, put on the lighting on the petals that landed on the bolt, highlight a bit of the wood texture, and like work on the small things here. So I thought this was a really nice sort of like thinking moment for myself, if I may say so, because that is sort of how we have to adapt. Because as you can see in the original reference photo, right, there's nothing that shows this depth. And if we had just like stuck with it and be like, okay, the reference is this, so we can't really do anything else, it would of course we will still have a nice gesture, but we will not have something exactly that we wanted to paint, which is what the whole point of the reference is for, is help us paint something that we want to create, right? And so yeah, towards the end, some final small details, correcting some mistakes, right? Adding some extra details like this box here. What else is there? Yeah, and adding these flying petals and then using selective color one more time to sort of like harmonize the darker areas and essentially add a bit of like atmosphere into them. So yeah, that is it for this particular piece, right? And of course, I didn't mention that, I'm sure you can already see, but along the way, right, we also adjusted some of the characters' pose a little bit, adding a bit more nuance into it, and then adding like a bit more detail to the costume and so on and so forth. So yeah, so that is it for this piece. So for this next piece, I wanted to capture the same scene in a bit of like a different angle and in a different light. So I decided to go for like a top-down sort of style or top-down position to show off a couple of things. Firstly is the trails in the water or the trails in the leaves, right? Or the petals that the boat makes. So that it's like a water surface, but it's so densely covered with petals that you can't really tell they can't really see most of the water, right? So you get like these really small gaps where you can see water, and then you have like this trail where the boat passed by. And then I also wanted to show off like this creature that's under the water as well, right? This sort of like snake, serpent, whatever it is that's under the water as well. So this was kind of like the objective of the piece, and here's how it began. So this is the beginning of the piece, and you might think, okay, this looks almost like the same as the finished product. And this was because there's a couple of things that benefit when you're drawing multiple pieces in the same sort of color range and the same lighting conditions. We can essentially borrow a lot of the previous colors a bit more directly, right? So rather than having to figure out where is that one? So rather than having to figure out, okay, what shade should we use for the petals, what shade we should use for the bolts, how bright should the light be, as we did here, right? Like we have no idea we have very little idea what exactly we want here. But now that we've completed this piece, right, I can easily say, okay, this is sort of like the relative color and the relative values that I want for all these individual elements. So this also saves me the process of having to draw in grayscale and then just paint color again, right? I can just start off with color. So this is why essentially the first stage of the painting looks so quick. And then the trails are just painted in manually, making sure to like give a bit of curve and give a bit of variation in the size of these clumps. And how I was inspired to do this is from this particular reference photo here. So again, right, I found it really interesting how densely were the petals packed that the boat like creates an interesting trail and disturbs the water and the patterns and creates like little streaks of emptiness through like the sea of petals. So this was sort of the inspiration behind the petals and the patterns that we see here. So immediately as you can see, I decided, okay, we should keep things a bit consistent and tune up the brightness a bit. And then once that's done, right, I decided to say, okay, so with this empty area behind here, we could do something with it. Like in this case, we could include like a monstrous creature. So important thing when doing stuff like this is to account for like cast shadows as well. So we have light coming down from above onto the lake, right? Like light coming down from above onto the lake, and then it casts shadows onto the monster below the water as well. So for example, if you drew these shadows like really close to the really close to the surface almost, it will look sort of weird because it's like, okay, so this thing is like right at the surface, right? So you don't want to do that, nor do you want to shade it too much because it makes it like way too deep in the water and you can't exactly tell, or rather it feels weird that you can still see it so clearly when it's supposedly deep in the water. Right, so this is kind of like the positioning of the leaves that I found is nice. And then this is how I started cleaning up the boat. So as you can see here, the boat is super rough, and while normally it is okay for very zoomed out shots, it's like the only sort of like structured or non-organic shape in the whole piece. So I thought it's important to keep the boat itself really clean as well. So I just simply painted it, making sure to keep the edges clean. Like, of course, you can see here, there's like a bit of messiness on the edge, but you can deal with that later, right? The important thing now is that we're focusing on the boat itself. And the character is sitting in this sort of position with a hat and the legs. Right, so kind of rough, and for the character, I didn't really use any reference. I probably should have, but I think the impression here is complete enough, right? You can have the character slightly leaning forward, and then they have like, you can see both their sort of cloak and their legs, which is, I think, good enough. And then here I added some patterns to the snake, or rather the creature under the water, and then painted in some scales a bit manually, which I think is always nice to do. Added more streaks because I thought, okay, so maybe the boat is moving slowly, right? So it's kind of like even the tip of the boat has like this extended wake effect. Right, so this is kind of what I thought would look very nice compositionally, because a lot of the lines here essentially like, essentially like kind of go to the boat in the front. And it creates like this separation in the piece where this is like quiet zone and this is like the noisy zone, right? Or where all action goes on. I think it also creates a nice ratio of quiet to activity that I think is nice for the composition itself, right? And of course, again, right, the reference is really inspirational because, of course, it didn't tell me to create this exact pattern itself. As you can see here, none of the boats are actually doing this really exaggerated pattern, but it did give me like the idea of we could make use of like openings in the water in the petals to create like a nice pattern effect. Yeah, and so to finish off, I threw on some petals onto the boat as per previously, and then yeah, added some flying ones to add a slight bit of depth. And that is it for this piece. Moving on to the next piece in the set. So far we've created a shot where we are sort of like mid-distance, where the character fills up the screen, like the full body fills up the screen, and then we have one where the character is really small in the screen. So I thought, okay, it might be nice to have like a close-up on the character's expression and face to, you know, essentially add a bit more depth to the scene and sort of like show a more complete side to like this particular setting. So to begin with, I did a line sketch, and as you can see, this line sketch is almost precise, right? Because or excuse a bit of roughness on this particular edge of face, but actually it's quite precise. So the reason I usually draw close-up portraits or sketches for close-up portraits more precisely is because the thing is that the entire piece relies on the face being really accurate to begin with. So even in a sketch stage, we cannot really afford to have the face be a bit too rough, right? Because in that case, we can't really read or tell if our painting is going to work out. Because sometimes it relies on us being able to show the expression of the character very clearly. So we have to be able to tell that, or rather we have to be able to immediately tell, or rather as soon as possible tell, if like this particular composition and this particular angle is okay. So immediately I tossed in a bit of color, and again, remember what I said, since we have already done 2 pieces with this exact setting, we can essentially use color straight away, fill in like the obvious things, like for example, we know exactly what shade is the character's skin tone in shadow, and then we can immediately carry it over here and then put it here. Same goes with the clothes, the hair, like the hat, and the petals on the water. So that's really helpful to essentially get this piece off the ground really quickly. And following that, I start figuring out, okay, so how exactly do you want to do the lighting on the character's face, right? Because with this particular situation, there are a couple of ways to do it, right? You could choose to have the stronger influence be the light coming in from the side, or you could choose to have the stronger influence be the light coming in from on top. Now, of course, you could say, wait a second, right? The head is obscuring the character's face. So should it be in complete shadow, or should we have like the head tilt at an angle to reveal enough of the face such that the sort of the brightness of the soft lighting from the brighter sky kind of, creates a bit of a top-down lighting effect? So these are kind of the questions that I think about, right? So in this case, I tried out for like a bit of a top-down effect first, and then just keep painting the face and figuring things out from there. So as you can see, a lot of it is figuring out exactly what lighting situation is suitable for us in this particular use case, right? And then just continue adjustments, figuring out like a bit of clothing at the back. And then here you can see I push the hat down because you're sitting way too far up on the head, right? It looks like it's floating above the head, and we don't want that, so we make an adjustment, as well as take the chance to kind of like paint in the proper perspective of the hat itself, right? Like how these things kind of like splay out and sort of recede into these like foreshortened areas of like the hat. Continue adjusting the face, adding like a bit of a color filter to help ourselves sort of visualize what the piece will end up looking like. And then just continue painting. So from here to here, as you can see, there's quite a big change on the face of the character, and this is why, right? So at this stage, I decided, okay, I think the top-down lighting is the way to go. So if we want to do it, we have to do it properly. So what does that mean? So if we're committed to having like this very weak and soft top-down light, we have to go and make the distinction between the surfaces on the face that receive this light, right? Excuse me. For example, like this surface, these surfaces all receive the soft light that comes down from above the sky. So it's important for us to distinguish this area versus this area, right? Where the lower jaw area and the chin area doesn't receive as much light that's coming from top down. So this is where, compared to before, where things were less decisive, right? For example, at this particular stage, things were not so decisive. I thought, okay, maybe we can just sort of like blur past it, but it turns out it's almost always better to be maybe a little bit unrealistic, but be decisive in, having like, okay, if we want top-down lighting, we have to do it the right way. We have to make like upper area of the face a bit brighter than a lower half, even if it's just by a little bit, right? So as you can see here, this is sort of the change, right? If you look at how the areas are brightened up, I would say this is like an important moment in the piece where I realized, oh, okay, so we have to do this more decisively and more clearly, right? Because even in, let's say, the real world situation, maybe this is like the actual appearance of the character's face. It's not unreasonable, right? Because sometimes lighting conditions line up in such a way that you get something a bit more ambiguous. But the thing is that, even in photography, good photography, often have good photography is often created by like photographers that have more like a decisive take and a decisive direction on how they want to capture their photos, right? So for example, if a photographer wanted to like lighten up the upper area of the character's face, they would say, okay, like maybe tilt your head out a bit and then like face the area where it's a bit brighter with less like foliage. And so I think this is kind of what I imagine like what a photographer would do. So this is kind of like, okay, so we can make this adjustment here and it's still kind of realistic, right? Yeah, and then from here on out, the biggest problem of the face being not properly well lit is solved, and then we can like add on small details like cleaning up the details on the head, like adding small hair strands. And then I realized, okay, so comparing these two, right? For this one, the entire area is covered in leaf petals, so it's not a huge problem per se, but I thought it would be nice to kind of like have the petals create sort of like a an arrow direction, right? For example, in here, I cleared out this area to be free of the petals, so you can have like this like zone, like this zone here of like water, plus this two zones of petals to like create a space, or rather a framing, almost a portrait frame for our character's face here, right? So this is sort of like the portrait frame, and this is like the character's face. Right, as compared to before where the petals are here, so it's really difficult to sort of get this nice shape flowing like this, right? For example, when a viewer looks at the image, and if they start on the left, right, when they start on the left, they have like this natural body of water, and rather this consistent color that their eyes can follow through, right, and look at a piece. And like a compositional consideration, this is something like a compositional consideration. And then we also have like the wind blowing this way, and then kind of like this region, this value block guiding the eye this way, and then sort of like this, right? So this is the kind of like compositional effect that we want to create. Yeah, and this is pretty much it for this particular piece. And to finish things off, I added a bit of flying petals because why not? And yeah, that's it for this piece. Moving on to the final piece in the set. So for this piece, I actually wanted to create something of like a finish, to show like the character arriving somewhere and then finding something of interest. So I think I could have done better by including a bit more painted elements, like for example like a bigger structure, or have like this creature here or the snake here painted in greater detail. So there are a few regrets here and there for this piece, but I think overall I think it's a nice wrap up to the set. So to begin with, I have like this really basic sketch here that I decided, okay, this is a good place to start with, right? We have a character on a boat, and then we sort of put together like a background and a bit of like a foreground where we have a bunch of petals floating on it. And then of course, because we know the colors, we could just rough them in for a bit. Of course, I made a couple of mistakes here, which we will fix. For example, like the proportion of the head compared to how high the character is standing in the boat. Right, so a couple of pretty bad mistakes right off the bat. So for the next step, I decided, okay, this is nice, but it's kind of the composition doesn't feel right to me. So I try a few different things, like opening up a few more gaps in the petals. So of course, one thing, right, we can use the scale of these objects in the water to tell us perspective. But the problem is these objects are really small and it can be difficult to figure out exactly what a perspective is. So we can use these like empty spaces to essentially do the same thing. Because all things equal, for example, the empty spaces near our position or near our camera is going to appear really big, and empty spaces far away is going to appear really small and compressed. So that's going to help us create this impression of depth as well. Right, and then we return to the previous background because I figured this one doesn't work either. Right, and then I decided, okay, so let's try to have something like actually interesting going on. We have like a giant snake, right? So this is sort of where I arrived at next. As you can see, as we go along, I'm constantly trying to correct the character's sort of the character in her standing position in the boat. And then I'm like, okay, so if we have the character low on the boat, it's going to make the scene feel bigger. Because you can see here, it's like, you really can't see much. And I sort of feel like it's better to have like the sky above exposed to sort of make the character look small. So this is sort of kind of like the direction that I decided to go with. And then finally I decided, okay, so we add a bit of foreground stuff in the form of this particular tree here. And conveniently, because it's sort of like in the foreground and we're looking up from underneath it, you can just use like a darker value to paint it and then have it naturally essentially be like in front of everything else. And then of course to corroborate this new addition, the front area of this water here is also in shadow as well. Right, and then the rest of the image pretty much stays the same, except we add in like the rest of the falling petals or snow. Really, it's a bit ambiguous here, which I think it's a nice touch in hindsight, right? I think it's a nice touch that because petals really can't, cherry blossom petals really can't fall this in such huge quantities in such a short amount of time. So I thought mixing in some snow would be nice as well. So yeah, this is the sort of final state for this piece, and this is more of a simple piece, so there's a bit of less explain to do. It was just me trying to get the composition to include a couple of interesting things, like for example the snakes or a bee snake, right? Making sure the scale sort of checks out, and yeah, that is it for this piece, and that is the last piece for this month's set or this process walkthrough, and I hope you found this helpful. As always, thank you so much for your support, and I hope to see you next month. And of course, not to forget, the tutorial video for this month will be coming out soon as well, and it will be on composition. And as always, thank you and hope to see you next month.